The question is, how did we come from a culture where everyone was getting married, everyone was expected to be married, to a culture where it's now Boaz is dating, wait your turn? Or even this whole big hostility of men versus women and women versus men, or even just like the rise of LGBTQ. Why is this happening? What is the cause? What is the equation? What are the consequences? What are the actions that led to the result that we have today? And how are we going to solve it? Well, today I'm going to speak to you about why this happened, the equation that brought us to where we are today. And then in the second part, I'm going to show you how we can climb out of this together. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, first, we have to understand that a lot of us in our 30s, we are almost like the Swan Princess, or, as Alison Armstrong says, frogs. And we can either be frog farmers, or we can be prince makers, or we can, just keep a woman stuck in the cesspool, as Rob Kalowski says, or we can get them out and by making an unbreakable vow, which is through marriage, and just removing their shame. Because a lot of what this culture is dealing with, the spirit around it, is shame at its root. And then shame, it brings loss of hope, and it also forces us to protect ourselves rather than giving to the world around us. All right, so what is the spirit behind this? All right, so this is the dragon prophecy. But we're going to talk about Iris instead. So with the dragon prophecy by Jonathan Cahn, he mainly talks about the physical aspects of the different, physical, like devastation that we see today in regards to, the 4 horses of the apocalypse, which that happens after the rapture. But the 4 horses of Zechariah, that happens before the rapture. And there are 4 horses that are meant to encourage the world and strengthen and also bring, some kind of judgment. But we also live in a season of grace. Okay, but what is it that is holding back the church from being its fullest and most beautiful self? And that is Iris. Now, Iris means many things. Iris, it's how we see things. It's like the pupil in our eyes that dilate to light. Iris, it means rainbow, and it also means promise. Now, let me clarify. When you see, kind of like the symbol of, the 2 snakes in the wings, I guess that's more of like Hermes, his staff. But it could be translated to Iris. And, that's not to say, like one is bad, one is the other, whereas like the other staff is like Moses' staff. Moses' staff just led them around in circles, okay? Whereas like Iris' staff, that had to do with, the Greeks and the Romans and, just the study of medicine. Whereas like, for the Jews, it was almost, purely through, prayer alone. Where, if it wasn't for, the Greeks and the Romans, we wouldn't have surgeries, we wouldn't have the medication we had today. We wouldn't have the medical research. It would be all through faith. So let me just kind of get that out of the way. That's not what we are talking about, okay? But what I am talking about is in regards to Jonathan Cahn and his book, Return of the Gods, and just how we fight not against people, but spirits and principalities of this dark age. And Iris, she is the one that is keeping back Joel's revival. Why is that? Who is she? So basically, she is the goddess. And she had the rainbow bow of war during Jesus' time, which according to Jonathan Cahn, the god or goddess who held the rainbow bow of war held the sexual revolution during that time. Okay? And so with Iris, her end game is to make marriages not happen at all. Because God's version of Iris, rainbow, in the Bible, that is translated to promise. And that's also symbolic of the future wedding, the banquet of Christ that Jesus is going to have with his church. Okay? And so it's kind of the counterfeit, where Iris is trying her best to tarnish the body of Christ. But my goal is that from this video that you will be able to know the devil's schemes, you'll be able to fight against it, and you will be able to heal, so that maybe one day that you will believe in love again. Okay, so how does it all begin? It starts off with the warrior and the armor bearer. Okay, so these symbolize, the men and the women. And, as you can see here, it's like, it's kind of like, usually at our age, like in our 30s, we have had broken hearts before. And so before, we met, our spouse or, another, person that we're going to get to know and then we're going to break up with. Okay. The process will have to, heal and just kind of create a ribbon so that our hearts will be ready for our future spouse. Okay. And so in this area, so this is like the warrior that symbolizes the man. So he's the one who normally does the fighting. And so he is symbolic to having a sword. Okay. And then whereas for the woman, she is considered the armor bearer. And actually in scripture, is also, more symbolic of helpmate. But also it's a symbol of having a shield, which I have my shield somewhere. Yes. Shield. Okay. And basically together, they can fight Iris. And also they have another weapon. So for women, their main weapon is love. And actually, one thing that you need to know about with the rose is that when you plant it in the ground in a certain way, it will grow and it will multiply into a rose bush. And roses are symbolic of love. Roses are symbolic of glory. Roses, they're symbolic of just hope. And so that's usually, the gift of the woman, because with the armor bearer, it's almost like they're female Barnabas, where they're kind of like the encouragers. They're kind of the ones that kind of give that extra oomph and spirit to their man so that they can do what they need to do. Okay. And then for the men, they have the branch of healing. And so with certain branches, like the olive branch, for instance, when you plant that branch in the ground, it can actually turn into a tree. And, and with the, this of healing, it's like a healing balm, it can, just give hope, give direction. And, this is kind of Isaiah 4:1, with this prophecy, with this particular event, which we'll go on later on the equation. But yes, so basically that should be, how relationships should work. Even in a dating relationship, it's like both people, they should support each other and help each other, become better versions of themselves. That even if they do part ways, at least they can keep building, and they don't have to their heart doesn't have to rip apart and then they have to put it back together, rip it apart and put it back together again. All right. So hopefully, it doesn't have to, go through the trauma, of dating. Dating can make you holy, as well as marriage, as well as being single, because each person should be sent by God for a specific reason in your life. And hopefully, the whole scenario of, if you date this person and it's the wrong person, you wasted those amount of years. I pray that will never happen for you. And if you follow this equation, it never has to, okay? And so, all right, so what happens? Okay, so it's, two hearts, the warrior and the armor bearer. Okay, I'm fine. Imagine there's the other heart here, okay? Versus the dragon, okay? And so the dragon is Iris, okay? And Iris, she has 2 snakes, okay? And how I see these snakes being is that one is the gender war. And so that has to do with, just trying to keep 2 genders away from each other, turning something good, turning something that maybe a couple created together in a dating relationship, and just making it feel like it was for nothing, and just having the devil have the last word. Okay? And then also the second one is like the racial snake or the age snake. It's almost like there should be like 2 snakes actually. Or 3 snakes, I should say. And so why brown? Because it's like that perfect middle. And, with, white people, they, have to deal with getting burnt. With darker people, they don't have to worry about wrinkles. And, but basically, these 2 snakes, they are holding back Joel's revival. Which in Joel's revival, it says, old men dream dreams, young men have vision, younger women will prophesy, and older women will give their 2 mites or 2 cents to heaven in prayer. And so with that, notice that it was like age and gender roles, in God's army, right? It had nothing to do with race. It had nothing to do with, any kind of ethnicity. It all had to do with age and gender. And that's also why the devil has been like so attacking, gender, throughout, this time, like, with like transgender, with like, you have like 500 genders that you can possibly choose from. That's why, because it says in when Jesus returns, that every tribe, every tongue, every nation will say that you are the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. Okay? All right. So anyway, we have these snakes, and, they whisper lies in our ears. And then from there, here comes Iris, and she has, her bow of war. And then, she aims that arrow with the rainbow. And then it goes over, it creates an archway, and it creates a path. And with her staff, that is direction. And so with her staff, she leads this couple over the rainbow. And first, with her arrows, she stabs the heart. And eventually then it's broken. Later, bitterness comes. Because like from a broken heart, after you break up, it's like, okay, I gotta forgive them. The question is like, what do we forgive them for? Do we forgive them for being a horrible Christian? Do we forgive them for being a hypocrite? Do we forgive them for, not being able to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit? Do we forgive them for, just being an evil person, or a narcissist, who doesn't care at all, who has like no love of Christ in them whatsoever? And you have to understand that if this really was a brother or sister in the Lord that you broke up with, that is dangerous territory, for us to forgive somebody, on those counts. If you forgive them for, misjudging you, or if you forgive them for, not telling you the truth because, there was, or if you forgive them for, because they didn't think you could handle the truth. If they, there's like different things that you can forgive them for rather than just like totally smashing their character and saying that they are the worst person on the possible planet, because that really, really goes against the prayer that Jesus prayed, allow them to know that they are my disciples because of their love for each other, okay? This even includes exes. So be careful. When you forgive them, be careful of the crime in which you are forgiving them, okay? And then later, once you just realize, like, oh my gosh, I totally just blew it, I'm so embarrassed. That's where shame comes in. Which I know, like green, that can symbolize, hope and growth and love. But in this case, we're going to say that it is shame that, because of their past, because of their now body count, they just, because of this relationship, they have shame. They're not proud. They're not glad that they were with this person. They aren't glad that, this person really helped them in their life. No, they just are full of shame. And that's how the enemy gets us. And then on top of that, with shame, for a male, that comes with, oh no, I have it. The leaves. Instead of being that, planting that tree, that's, healing, they just shriveled up that girl's heart. And instead of, love and hope, you know what? This woman is just wilted. And that man, he may feel like, why do I want to, date again? Why do I want to marry again? And so that's where the white flag comes in. Not the flag of a pure heart, but a white flag of surrender to the gender war. It's like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to love again. I'm not going to get hurt again. I'm not going to have my heart broken again. I'm not going to go through that, same bitterness and, hate cycle again. I'm not going to add to my shame. No. For women, they can either be like, okay, love is not real. And men can do the same. Love is not real. And so what does that result in? They just start sleeping around. It's like, okay, they're not going to commit to me anyway. They're not going to choose me anyway. So I just might as well enjoy what I can and just sleep with whoever I want to. Or the other side of it is, like, you know what? Since men have hurt me again and again and again, I refuse to trust another man again. And that's where, like, the rose is, like, so wilted, right? And, and so they just won't let any love in, and they're going to be the cat lady for the rest of their lives. And their hearts are going to be stone. And same with the men. It's like, you know what? This one woman hurt me. She misjudged me. She, I gave her everything and she took it all. I will never trust another woman again. I will never marry one because they're just going to take everything. They don't care. They don't love me. They won't try to protect me like I would them. And so, in other words, like I know for the Queen's Club with Alison Armstrong, she said that instead of men protecting women, they in turn protect themselves. And so, and that is the part of a man that, it's not who they're intended to be. Like, their natural ability is to protect. And a woman's natural ability is to love and encourage. And when we get into these roles of just being hurt again and again and again, and our hearts ripped in half again and again and again, and it ripped again and again and again and again. And then you have to somehow put the pieces back together. And you have to hope that there's enough band-aids to go around to put the pieces back together of your broken heart. That's almost where we're at. You know, just like a lot of people, like, they've almost checked out. And that's where, like, the feminist movement happens. It's like, yep, I'm a feminist. I gotta figure this out myself because I can never trust men. And then for men, that's where, like, Red Pill comes in. It's like, you know what? I'm just gonna live for myself because I can never trust women. They aren't gonna help. They're just gonna hurt. And then for women, on the other side, for the feminists, all they do is lie and American Pie. And so how do you find that middle ground? How do you move from Iris the Dragon's lies? How do we move forward in a society to just see that each person in your life is a blessing? Okay, well, I'm not going to go into the full equation at the end, but I will say this. All right, so for ladies, you know, if a man does take you out on a date, be grateful. If he does find you sexually attractive, great. You know, would you want him to be revolted? But at the same time, why waiting works. You want to make sure that this guy loves you for you. And that, you know, he doesn't just eros you, but he phileos you, he agapes you, and one day he would like to consummate love with you. Which consummate, I guess, is like several different, it's almost like all the strongest loves combined into one. Because there's like 10 different kinds of love. Okay? And for a woman, you know, if you are in a case where, you know, he's fornicating with you or, you know, and your harlot status, there is wisdom to what the posts were saying. You know, where it's like, okay, you know, instead of say your boyfriend, introduce him as your husband and see how he reacts. Because God doesn't want you living in sin, being a harlot. He wants you to be a wife. And if he is leading you to sin and not towards God, if he's making your relationship with God harder, because you know in your heart that, you know, fornication, that brings up insecurity. Does he really love me, or am I just his placeholder? Does he love me until he decides not to? That brings a lot of shame. And for women, you know, just be grateful that he sees, you know, good in you, that he finds you attractive. You know, that's male's nature. No need to bring him shame. Just say, thank you, I'm attracted to you too. But until, you know, I get a commitment, I'm not going to be stupid. And I'm going to protect my heart until I know that you want to protect it as well. Because I am tired. I worked hard to get my heart how it is. And I am tired of putting the pieces back together myself. And so, and also just like the whole honor process. You know, like, I don't know if you happen to see like Cutting Edge. It's like a skater movie. But basically there's this story of this girl named Alex, and basically her first partner, you know, yes, they did break up, but during that relationship, she received the skills that she needed in order to go to the next level. If it was not for her first partner, Mr. Conroy, you know, she never would have been able to learn figure skating. You know, she was an ice hockey player, you know, she was not a figure skater. But because of their relationship, she not only learned those skills, but she won the gold. And also she got a new partner who created a move that was never seen before. that was never seen before. And if it wasn't for her first partner, with Mr. Conroy, she never would have been able to, have a move done and named after her because of her new partner, James Mackenzie. So yeah, the first one, they had the Penchenko, which was done before, that made them the gold. But it was done before. Okay? But this new one, this new partner, they did something brand new. And he honored her and named it after her, which is pretty cool. So just know that in a dating relationship, it doesn't have to always look like this. It doesn't always have to end like this. You can move on. You can heal. You just have to have the right boundaries. And I really like Chip Ingram's book when he had like Sex 180, his theory of, I'm going to treat you like somebody else's wife, that even if it doesn't work out, that your future wife will thank me. And then the woman is like, I'm going to treat you like somebody else's husband, that if it doesn't work out, she will thank me. And so that way you're covered, and it's more important about the relationship with God that you have rather than who is in a relationship with you. I mean, is it nice to always, have somebody, there with you, to build with you, to strengthen you, to correct you, that, you can just like let down your guard and be yourself? Absolutely. Yes, that is the true dream. Somebody to build with, somebody to walk beside you, somebody to correct you when you're wrong, somebody, who has your best interest at heart, somebody to protect you, somebody to encourage you. That's the goal. But as you are getting to that goal, just be aware. And I would recommend, highly recommend for females, this book, Prayers for Your Future Husband. And even if, sometimes God calls us to singleness, sometimes he does actually have a partner for you and God does answer your prayers. But in the meantime, it's more important that you keep your heart from bitterness, from shame. And the best way is, just by praying, Lord, allow me to honor this man. Thank you for allowing one of your loved ones, your sons, to be in my life. God, allow me to help them and not hurt them. Allow them to go further than they were, than if they weren't with me. And then the same thing, if a man prays, Lord, this is your daughter. Even if she's not for me, God, I pray that I will not hurt her, that I will further her, that, that she will see your goodness through our relationship and she will not look back with regret. And so, just something like that. I mean, just either way, just like allow us to do good, like phileo each other, like friendship love. We need to stop this whole like love going to hate thing. We don't want to walk around in shame. We're looking for that Isaiah 4:1 of that branch of healing. That branch of healing that can turn into Isaiah 61, which can become an oak of righteousness. So, all right, thanks for listening. Bye.